Welcome to Hood Politics. In this episode, I will be discussing the story of David Montemayor. The facts of the case are as follows. On Wednesday, October 2nd, 2002, shortly before 7 a.m., a quiet Buena Park neighborhood was awakened to the sound of gunfire. Neighbors called 911, and shortly afterwards, police and paramedics arrived at the 8100 block of Pinion Street and found a 44-year-old man named David Montemayor lying on the sidewalk. He had been shot multiple times and was pronounced dead at the scene. David was a loving husband and father of 3 children. He had no criminal record and by all accounts was a great guy. Shortly after the shooting, 3 Pacoima Flats gang members were charged with David's murder. Investigators wondered how David ended up crossing paths with a group of notorious gang members. They theorized that the shooting could have been a case of mistaken identity or even a robbery gone wrong, but little did they know that their investigation will lead into a web of lies, jealousy, and greed. David Montemayor was born on May 9th, 1958, and was the second of 4 children. He grew up in Galveston, Texas, where his siblings, Deborah, Darren, and Michael, were raised to value family and hard work. David had a great attitude and always wanted to help out. At a young age, David was helping work on some farm equipment when he stuck his right arm into one of the machines. His arm became stuck between some moving gears, and the machine ripped his arm off. The accident caused severe blood loss, but luckily, David was rushed to the hospital where the doctors were able to stop the bleeding. Although he now had a life-altering disability, David didn't let that stop him. He kept his joyful spirit and was even more determined to work hard and become successful. In the early 1980s, the Montemayor family moved to Southern California to take on a new business venture, a transportation and storage company called Interfreight Transport. David's father, Pete, instilled an entrepreneurial spirit into his kids and allowed them to help build the business. Interfreight started out small. They operated out of a warehouse in Rancho Dominguez, which is an area just outside of Compton. Darren was the driver, Deborah worked in administration, and David helped out with dispatching and logistics. Deborah was the oldest child and was the first to leave the nest. She married a man in 1984 and together they had 3 sons. But unfortunately, the relationship didn't last and shortly afterwards, the couple got divorced. Deborah kept the last name Perna, but was left to raise the boys on her own. From that point, Pete took on the fatherly role to his grandsons. Deborah was able to find the balance between helping build the family business and being a single mother of 3. She worked long hours, but always found time for her sons. She attended all of their school events, as well as their football and baseball games. She would also take the boys dirt bike riding and on vacations. David also started a family. In 1989, he married a woman named Susan, and together they had 3 children. David was earning a good salary working with his family and was able to buy a home in the city of Buena Park in Orange County. David and Susan's home was a house of love, and everyone that visited said they could feel the love as soon as they walked in the door. The welcoming environment made the house a prime location for family get-togethers and birthday parties. Meanwhile, Interfreight was doing very well and was growing year by year. Pete owned the company outright, but ultimately wanted to leave the business to his children and have David and Deborah share a leadership position within the company. But as time went on, David and Deborah began slipping into their respective roles. Deborah was great on the administrative side, but she didn't exhibit leadership qualities. Meanwhile, David was pretty much running Interfreight and knew the business like the back of his hand. In 1992, after working alongside of her family for 5 years, Deborah was barely making ends meet and decided to leave the company in search of a better opportunity. Deborah could have went to Pete for help and he would have written her a check on the spot, but she was proud and didn't want to ask for help. She rather earned the money on her own. Deborah's absence affected Interfreight severely, and soon after her departure, the company began to struggle. Pete contacted Deborah and told her that the company was declining and he needed her help. The two discussed the pay bump, and in 1996, Deborah returned to Interfreight and resumed her job as an administrator. Shortly after her return, the company began recovering and ultimately grew. From the outside looking in, it seemed like everything was back on track, but that was far from the truth. David and Deborah hated working together, and they only tolerated one another out of respect for their father and for the greater good of the company. By 2002, Pete was planning his retirement and started slowly phasing himself out of Interfreight. Deborah noticed the changes and believed that her future was in jeopardy. She had no ownership in the company and felt slighted because not only did she help build it, but when she left, the business suffered, and when she returned, the business prospered, which proved that she was an essential part of the company, but wasn't being treated as such. Deborah felt that David was manipulating Pete and slowly pushing him out the company. She went to Pete plenty of times to voice her concerns, but was told that everything was ultimately Pete's decision and he wasn't being manipulated, but was just making the best decision for the business. Deborah was furious. Not only did she feel wronged, but a rumor began circulating around the office that David was stealing money from the company and stashing the cash and coffee cans in his garage. Deborah continued her administrative position at the company while contemplating her next move. On Wednesday, October 2nd, 2002, just after 6 a.m., David left his home and made the commute to Interfreight. He arrived at the warehouse, opened the gates, and disarmed the alarm. While getting things ready for the day, David was approached by two armed men. They ordered him to get into his truck, a white Ford Expedition, and drive them to his home. The two men got into David's truck, while a third accomplice followed behind them in a blue Chevy Blazer. As the truck made its way down Pinion Street and approached Locust Drive, David exited the Expedition and began running away. The two men got out the truck and started chasing David and yelling for him to come back. David continued running away while screaming for help and begging the man not to shoot him. Moments later, both men opened fire. David was hit and fell to the ground. The shooters ran over to him and one of them opened fire again, this time hitting David in the back of the head. The two men then got into the Blazer and fled the scene. A man named Tim Mize was collecting cans nearby when he witnessed the shooting. He then got into his own car and followed the Blazer and was able to get a partial license plate number. Tim flagged down a patrol officer and told him about the shooting. He pointed the officer in the suspect's direction and gave him the plate number. The officer radioed an all-points bulletin for the Blazer, and a detective named Sean Morgan raced to find the truck. While one group of officers pursued the Blazer, another group made their way to the crime scene. A detective named Gregory Pelton arrived at the scene and helped lead the investigation. He saw a white Ford Expedition with the driver's door open, stopped in the middle of the street. He then noticed multiple bullet casings at the scene and saw a man laying face down on the sidewalk. He approached the man and saw that he had been shot multiple times. Pelton noticed he had one arm and wasn't carrying any ID. Investigators ran the Expedition's license plate number and saw that the truck was registered to David. They contacted Susan and asked her to describe David. She told them that he only had one arm. At that point, investigators knew that David was the victim and he had been killed a mile from his home. Detectives then drove to the Montemayor's home along with the chaplain and informed Susan of David's death. One of David's neighbors told investigators that he saw David drive past the house at 6:45 while being followed closely by a blue truck. The neighbor thought it was odd because David was usually at work by that time. Meanwhile, the pursuit of the Blazer had become a full-fledged high-speed chase. When Detective Morgan got behind the truck, the suspects noticed they were being followed and sped away. Multiple news stations televised the pursuit as the Blazer sped down residential streets and highways. The suspects were flashing gang signs out the window and were seen throwing two guns from the Blazer during the pursuit. The truck lost speed and began smoking from the engine. At that point, a patrol officer initiated a pit maneuver and the truck spun out of control and crashed into a wall. One of the suspects got out of the truck with a black object in his hand and ran towards a local park. Officers then opened fire, hitting him in the shoulder. The man surrendered and was placed under arrest and transported to the hospital. The black object was a cell phone. After witnessing what happened to the other suspect, the remaining two also surrendered and were taken into custody. David's ID was found in one of their pockets. The two handguns were later recovered. One was the murder weapon and the other was linked to bullets and casings found at the scene. The three suspects were identified as members of the Pacoima Flats gang. 26-year-old Armando Macias, also known as Pirate, 24-year-old Alberto Martinez, also known as Crook, and 17-year-old Gerardo Lopez, also known as Sniper. Pacoima Flats is one of the oldest and most notorious gangs in Pacoima. They have been the target of numerous federal indictments and have been responsible for countless shootings and multiple murders. Pacoima is nearly an hour away from Buena Park, and seeing how David had no criminal record or gang ties, investigators wondered how these two worlds collided. They theorized it could have been a carjacking or a robbery gone wrong, but what would have made David their target? Investigators questioned the three suspects, but they all stayed tight-lipped and didn't tell investigators anything. Detectives then visited Interfreight and began interviewing employees. They learned that David was usually the first one at the office, but on that morning, the business was open as employees arrived, but David was nowhere to be found. Investigators saw that everyone was distraught, but Deborah seemed to be taking the news the hardest. She told detectives that she didn't know what happened or why anyone would want to hurt David. While at the office, investigators became suspicious of Deborah's secretary. She was a 25-year-old woman named Elda Myra Corona, who fellow employees called Myra. Deborah hired Myra in early 2002, and she was only scheduled to work at Interfreight for a few months, but the two became so close that Deborah brought her back after her assignment ended. After the employees were asked if there had been any suspicious people at the company, they told investigators that some shady-looking people had been visiting Myra. Also, there were pictures of gang members on Myra's desk, including a picture of her fiance, who was a known gang member. Investigators questioned Myra, but during the interview, nothing stuck out or seemed suspicious. Detectives then decided to explore another angle, David's business dealings at Interfreight. It's not uncommon for trucking businesses to dip into illicit activities and become smugglers. Everything from stolen items to guns to drugs and even human beings have all been found on the back of a truck. Investigators then went through Interfreight's business records as well as David's personal finances with a fine-tooth comb. They found that everything was on the up and up and being ran by the book. The investigation also put the rumor of David embezzling money to rest. After finding that David didn't have any personal ties or business ties to the gang members, investigators knew that someone had asked them to murder David, but the question remained, who would want David dead and why? Investigators obtained a search warrant to look into the suspect's cell phones. They discovered that all the phones were purchased together by a man in San Diego. They contacted the buyer and he told them that he bought the phones for a man named Anthony Navarro. Anthony was a 35-year-old member of Pacoima Flats and went by the nickname Droopy. He joined the gang at 12 years old, and at the age of 14, he was arrested for manslaughter. During a separate prison stint for robbery, he became a Mexican mafia associate. Investigators found that Armando and Alberto had been in contact with Anthony. They then executed a search warrant on Anthony's home in Sun Valley, just south of Pacoima. During the search, investigators found the Blazer's vehicle title. It belonged to a man named Daniel Chaidez, and his registered address was Anthony's home. They also found Pacoima Flats graffiti in the garage. The suspects' nicknames were listed in the graffiti. Anthony wasn't home at the time, and his wife Bridget said she hadn't seen him in days. Investigators knew that he was involved and began searching for him. During their investigation, detectives learned that Anthony was a federal informant. He would commit crimes, and just when he's about to get caught, he would contact his handlers at the LAPD, ATF, and FBI and give them information about other crimes in exchange for his freedom. After days of searching, detectives Pelton and Morgan decided to stake out Anthony's home in an unmarked car. Shortly afterwards, they saw the garage door open and the car pull out and drive away. Detectives followed the car and watched it pull into a 7-Eleven parking lot. They then boxed it in and identified themselves as officers. They ordered the driver and passenger to exit the vehicle at gunpoint. They found that Anthony was the driver and Daniel was the passenger. Both men were detained and Anthony consented to a vehicle search. Investigators found a piece of paper that had David's home address and phone number written on it. There was also something written in Spanish on the paper. Once a bilingual officer arrived at the scene, he was able to translate it. It said, "One armed." The paper was branded with Interfreight's company logo, address, and phone number, so investigators knew that whoever had written the note did so from the office. After further searching the car, they found a picture of Myra and a loaded gun in the center console. Anthony and Daniel were then arrested. Investigators interviewed Anthony, and initially he denied knowing anything about the murder. But after detectives confronted him with the note, the picture of Myra, and the call logs showing that he had been in contact with Armando and Alberto, he decided to come clean. Anthony told detectives that they committed the murder at the request of Myra, and she had given them the note. Detectives then reached out to Myra for an interview, but were having a hard time tracking her down. They then surveilled her home and waited for her to show up. Later that day, she arrived, and detectives approached her as she was entering the house and asked her for a follow-up interview. She agreed and was transported to the police station. During the interview, Myra initially denied knowing anything about the murder, but after detectives confronted her with the note, she told them that she didn't write it, Deborah did. She told detectives that while working at Interfreight, she built a close friendship with Deborah. She went on to say that Deborah would always complain about David, saying that he was stealing money from the company and he was going to ruin the business. One day, Deborah approached Myra and said, "I need David to disappear. I need him taken care of." Myra responded, "I can't really help you out with that." And Deborah replied, "No, but you know people who can." Myra initially brushed Deborah off and assumed that she wasn't being serious, but was just angry and wasn't thinking logically. But as time went on, Deborah remained persistent and even gave her the note with David's address and phone number on it. Myra was still unsure, but ultimately, she decided to help. Investigators learned that Anthony was Myra's drug dealer, and he had come to the office on numerous occasions to make drop-offs. Deborah suggested that Myra asked Anthony to carry out the murder. Myra told her she could ask him, but he won't do it for free. Deborah told Myra that David was stealing from the company and there was $50,000 in cash stashed inside of a coffee can in his garage, and Anthony could take that and anything else he wants. Myra told her that she would run the idea by him. Myra met up with Anthony later that night and told him that Deborah wants him to kill her brother. He just laughed it off. In mid-August of 2002, Anthony drove Myra to Northern California to visit her father. He was an inmate at Pelican Bay State Prison and was said to be a member of the Mexican Mafia. While up north, she also planned to visit her fiance, who was in jail in Humboldt County. During the trip, Myra received a call from Deborah. When Deborah heard that Anthony was in the car, she asked Myra if she told him about the hit. Myra then asked Anthony again, and he asked for David's address, but she didn't have the note on her. Myra and Anthony met up a few days later to discuss the particulars. She gave him the note and told him about the $50,000 stashed in the garage. She also told him about David's work schedule and how he's alone when he opens up Interfreight in the mornings. From there, Anthony recruited Armando, Alberto, and Gerardo for the hit. The plan was to kidnap David from Interfreight and make him drive to his home, where the hitman would take the $50,000 and kill David. Armando, Alberto, and Gerardo traveled to Interfreight early on the morning of October 2nd and waited for David to arrive. Once he did, they approached him and ordered him to get into his expedition and take them to his home. Armando and Gerardo got into the expedition with David, while Alberto followed behind in the Blazer. David drove past his house and continued driving for about a mile. As he made his way down Pinion Street, he bolted from the expedition while yelling for help and begging the men not to shoot him. Armando and Gerardo started chasing David and yelling for him to come back. Moments later, they raised their guns and opened fire. David was hit and fell to the ground. The shooters ran over to him, and Armando fired another shot into the back of David's head. They then got into the Blazer, and Alberto sped away and got into the high-speed chase with police that ended with Armando getting shot in the shoulder and them surrendering. It's believed that David intended to take the men to his home, but once he saw Susan's car in the driveway, he knew that she hadn't left to take the kids to school. At that point, David decided to sacrifice his life for the safety of his family. After speaking to Myra, investigators had her call Deborah and tell her that police arrested Anthony and found the note, and now they want to speak to her, and what should she say or do? During the call, Deborah told Myra to keep quiet and she wasn't going to discuss anything over the phone. Judging by that reaction, investigators knew that Deborah was involved. At around 1 a.m. the next morning, they made their way to Deborah's home. They knocked on the door and she answered with a confused look on her face. They informed her that she was under arrest for David's murder and she began pleading her innocence. She was then taken to the police station for questioning. Initially, Deborah denied knowing anything about David's murder, but after investigators played the recording of her phone call with Myra, she immediately broke down and even urinated on herself. Deborah told detectives that she didn't want her brother killed, she only wanted him to be hurt. Investigators felt that Deborah was trying to distance herself from the murder by admitting to a lesser charge, but the felony murder rule stated that if someone is killed during the commission of a felony, everyone involved in the crime will be charged with the person's murder, and since Deborah ordered the hit, she was just as responsible as the shooters. On Saturday, October 19th, 2 weeks after David's murder, Deborah was charged with murder for the death of David Montemayor, with the special circumstance of murder for financial gain in the course of a robbery and kidnapping. The family was in shock. They were adamant that investigators had made a mistake and Deborah's arrest was just one big misunderstanding. Detectives remained tight-lipped about the investigation and wouldn't tell the family anything. When they inquired about getting Deborah out, investigators told them that she wasn't going anywhere and gave her no bail. Myra, Anthony, Armando, Alberto, and Gerardo were each charged with murder for the death of David Montemayor, with special circumstances of murder for financial gain in the course of a robbery and kidnapping, as well as gun and gang enhancement charges. Although Gerardo was a juvenile at the time of the murder, he was charged as an adult. All of the suspects pled not guilty and were given separate trials. On Friday, February 28, 2003, at 10:15 a.m., Anthony, Armando, and Alberto were awaiting pretrial hearings in the holding cell in the North Justice Center in Fullerton. Armando then pulled out a jail-made knife and attacked Anthony. Anthony was stabbed over 10 times and transported to the hospital where he made a full recovery. No weapon was recovered after the attack, and it's believed that Armando flushed it down the toilet. Investigators think that the attack occurred because Armando felt that Anthony was snitching. On Wednesday, March 24th, 2004, Myra struck a deal with the district attorney. In exchange for her testimony against the others, she was able to plead guilty to manslaughter. 3 years after David's murder, in October of 2005, Deborah's trial began. The prosecutor during the trial was a man named Dan Wagner. Wagner painted Deborah as a greedy, jealous, and cold-hearted woman. He said that David and Deborah were involved in a power struggle over the family business, and the two would often argue in front of the other employees. But while David let his work and leadership skills speak for why he deserved the business, Deborah decided to take a different route and put a hit out on her own brother. Wagner told the court that Deborah was never sad for David, but was only sad that she was caught. The defense attorney during the trial was a man named Michael Mofetta. Mofetta told the court that Deborah was innocent, and Myra took it upon herself to hire Anthony for the hit in hopes of getting some of the rumored $50,000. He went on to say that there is no evidence against Deborah outside of the phone call that Myra made to her from the police station, and even that doesn't prove guilt. Myra took the stand and told the court that Deborah always complained to her about David and accused him of stealing money and ruining the company. Myra said that Deborah inquired about the hit multiple times and was essentially begging for it to be done. Susan also took the stand and told the court how good of a husband, father, and overall person David was. She went on to say that her and her children are still broken and dealing with the grief of David's murder. On Friday, October 28, 2005, Deborah was found guilty of murder for the death of David Montemayor, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and murder for financial gain, along with special circumstances of committing murder in the course of a robbery and kidnapping. The family was split when it came to the verdict. Some members of the family, such as Pete, believed that the jurors got it wrong and Deborah was innocent, while others, such as Deborah's oldest son, Russell, believed that his mother was guilty. He even stormed out of the courtroom after prosecutors played the recording of Deborah's phone call with Myra for the jury. Russell later said that he felt hurt because he stood by his mother throughout the whole ordeal and believed that she was innocent, and it broke his heart when he found out the truth. On Thursday, February 16, 2006, Deborah Perna was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On Wednesday, December 14, 2005, Gerardo was found guilty of murder for the death of David Montemayor, as well as special circumstances of committing murder in the course of a robbery and kidnapping, along with gun and gang enhancement charges. On Friday, June 2, 2006, Gerardo Lopez was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Anthony's trial began on Thursday, September 6, 2007. Wagner painted Anthony as a cold-blooded killer with a long rap sheet and a propensity for violence. He told the court that Anthony used his status within the gang to recruit the others, and without his okay, the murder would have never taken place. The defense attorney in the case was a man named Henry Halpern. Halpern told the court that Anthony wasn't involved in the murder, and in fact, he wasn't even in the state at the time, but was in Las Vegas. He went on to say that it wouldn't have made any sense for Anthony to let Armando, Alberto, and Gerardo use a getaway vehicle that was registered to his address. Wagner told the court that while Anthony was in Las Vegas at the time of the murder, he was still pulling the strings. Wagner said that Bridget did report the Blazer stolen at around 9 a.m. on the morning of the murder, but that was only after she learned of the pursuit and wanted to distance Anthony from the murder. Also, Daniel, Anthony, nor Bridget inquired about the Blazer while it was in police custody, and if someone's vehicle was stolen, taken on a high-speed chase, and wrecked, the average person would contact police about it. Wagner then presented call logs that showed Anthony had been in contact with Bridget, Myra, Armando, and Alberto on the night prior to the murder and on the morning of the murder. Wagner also told the court how Bridget called Nextel customer service on the day of the murder and changed Anthony's cell phone number. Halpern said that Anthony was a high-ranking member of his gang, and it was a necessity for him to have multiple phones at once in order to stay on top of gang business. He went on to say that Anthony was no longer in possession of the phone that was linked to the murder, and he had stopped using it weeks prior to the murder. Anthony took the stand and told the court about his time as an informant. He said he began cooperating with the FBI in the year 2000 after the Mexican Mafia killed his cousin. He also cooperated with the ATF for a few months in mid-2002. The court saw evidence that Anthony provided information about gun and drug sales, helped agents hunt down an Israeli mobster, and prevented 5 murder plots, including one against an LAPD officer. Anthony also infiltrated Tijuana's Arellano Felix cartel. Anthony testified that an aspect of his cooperation required him to attend Mexican Mafia meetings while wearing a listening device and a camera. The FBI paid Anthony for his services, and he gave the money to a Mexican Mafia member, saying that the money was protection payments that he extorted from other gang members. This earned Anthony a high-ranking position in Pacoima's gang world. Anthony said he believed the gang grew suspicious of him in early 2002 after he was arrested for possession of a firearm by a felon, which was a potential third strike, but he was released on low bail and never formally charged. Anthony said he met Myra in April of 2002 after Armando introduced them. Myra told Anthony that she was the daughter of a Mexican Mafia member named Felipe Vivar, and he put her in charge of gang activity in the area. She went on to say that Felipe wanted him to kill someone in Orange County. By this time, Anthony had been terminated as an informant and in turn was no longer making payments to the Mexican Mafia. He was concerned that they would assume he was withholding payments and order him to be killed. In 2002, Anthony was the victim of 2 freeway shootings, and he felt that it was the Mexican Mafia sending him a warning. He called Myra, hoping that she could help make things right. Myra told him that she could arrange for the removal of the green light, but it would cost $14,000. Anthony only had $7,000 and gave it to Myra, and the hit would cover the remaining balance. She told him that David was her boss and that he owed Felipe money. She then gave him the note with the David's address and phone number on it. After the meeting, Anthony contacted his handler at the ATF, James Starkey, and told him about the murder plot. But Starkey told Anthony that he was too busy and instructed him to contact an LAPD detective named Rod Rodriguez. Anthony relayed the information to Rodriguez, but he didn't know the name of the intended victim. Rodriguez told him to find out the target's name because without it, there's nothing he could do. Anthony told the court that he played no part in the murder and that it wouldn't have made sense for him to alert law enforcement about a murder he was participating in. Anthony believed that Myra went behind his back and recruited Armando for the hit. Wagner told the court that Anthony was just trying to paint himself as a victim rather than a conspirator. He went on to say that Anthony had manipulated the government during his time as an informant, and now he's in the courtroom attempting to manipulate the judge and jury. Wagner said that Anthony did contact Agent Starkey and Detective Ramirez and alert them about a mysterious murder plot, but that was just a ploy to deflect culpability. Wagner said that Anthony is a bad guy and told the court about multiple heinous incidents involving Anthony, one of which took place in February of 2002 when a group of men rushed into a home and shot one of its residents in the head. It's believed that Anthony was among the group, but there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges. Another incident took place in March of 2002 when a man was asked to deliver a letter to members of Pacoima Flats. The letter was from a rival gang member. 2 weeks after handing off the letter, the man was taken to Anthony's house at gunpoint. He was then forced into the garage where he was beaten and tortured. The man recalled Anthony saying, "He's gotta go," and afterwards he was taken away and shot 14 times. The man said that it's a miracle he's still alive. Wagner continued telling the court about the numerous crimes Anthony committed and how his handlers would magically make the charges disappear. On Thursday, October 18th, 2007, Anthony was found guilty of murder for the death of David Montemayor, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and special circumstances of committing murder in the course of a robbery and kidnapping, along with gun and gang enhancement charges. On Friday, July 11th, 2008, Anthony Navarro was sentenced to death. On Thursday, May 6th, 2010, Alberto was found guilty of murder for the death of David Montemayor, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and special circumstances of committing murder in the course of a robbery and kidnapping, along with gun and gang enhancement charges. On Friday, August 6th, 2010, Alberto Martinez was sentenced to death. On Thursday, April 21st, 2011, Armando was found guilty of murder for the death of David Montemayor, as well as conspiracy to commit murder and special circumstances of committing murder in the course of a robbery and kidnapping, along with gun and gang enhancement charges. On Thursday, September 1st, 2011, Armando Macias was sentenced to death. After acting as the prosecution's star witness during nearly a decade of trials, Myra was sentenced to 14 years in prison. She has since been released. Susan was satisfied with the sentencings. She was at every trial, and at times, she and her children took the stand and told the court how the loss of David affected their family. She also spoke about Interfreight and said that without David's leadership, the company began declining and was ultimately forced to close its doors, putting a sad end to the family business that would have been handed down for generations to come. In 2019, Assembly Bill 1812 was enacted. The bill allowed for inmates who were sentenced to life for crimes committed as a juvenile to request a lesser sentence after serving at least 15 years. On Friday, August 16th, 2024, Gerardo's case was transferred to juvenile court, and on August 20th, Gerardo was released from prison and has since self-deported to Mexico. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer condemned the decision. He stated, "California law has devolved to the point that there is no truth in sentencing, and there are little, if any, consequences for committing the most heinous of crimes." He continued, "This case is another painful example of how the rights of cold-blooded killers continue to take priority over the rights of victims." Susan was also disappointed in the court's decision to release Gerardo. She stated, "I realize there's not much I can do. I feel a little helpless at this point." While on death row, Alberto became the center of another story involving love, money, and murder. In the late 2000s, a man named Nicholas Martinez was released from prison. He is a member of the Compton Barrio Tortilla Flats gang and goes by the nickname Funny. After his release, Nicholas was deported to Mexico. While there, he met a woman named Brenda. The two got close and eventually started dating and had a daughter. Nicholas worked as a bouncer at a nightclub in Tijuana. One night, after his shift ended, he and two other bouncers went to a bar called the Black Bull, where they got drunk and got into a brawl. Someone then pulled a gun and shots were fired. The bar was in chaos as patrons ran and dug for cover. When the smoke cleared, one man was dead, and Nicholas found himself back in prison for murder. Brenda thought about her and her daughter's futures and decided to travel to the United States for a better life. Nicholas shared a jail cell with another deportee named Flaco. Flaco had a cell phone and told Brenda that he would introduce her to someone that would look out for her in the US. In 2014, Brenda made the trip across the border without a visa or job prospects. Flaco called Brenda and patched in a man nicknamed Beto. Brenda asked Beto where did he live, and he replied, "If I tell you, you won't want to talk to me." Later in the conversation, he told her that he lived on death row. Beto was Alberto, and he had used his connections in the gang world to find a woman that was new to the US and needed help adjusting, and Brenda was the perfect fit. According to Brenda, everything started off great. Alberto called her multiple times a day to check up on her and let her know that he was there if she needed anything. He even upgraded to a better phone so the two of them could video call. Alberto moved Brenda into an apartment on 133rd Street in Compton. He paid the $700 a month rent and also sent her money for her phone bill, to get her nails done, and to go shopping at the mall. He also bought clothes and school supplies for her daughter. Alberto was generous, protective, and caring, and Brenda quickly fell in love with him. For a while, everything was going well, but then Alberto started asking Brenda for favors. He asked her to send some money to his friends' wives. Brenda knew that his friends were inmates, but she didn't think much of it. Alberto told her that the members of his gang with legitimate jobs were helping the ones in prison. Shortly afterwards, men began dropping off cash at Brenda's apartment, $1,000 to $2,000 at a time. Alberto gave Brenda the names and addresses of the women, and she sent them money orders. One day, he asked her to send some money and thank you cards to a few people. He then gave her a list of 5 names: Hector Ayala, Fernando Bermudez, also known as Fernie B, Jesse Gonzalez, also known as Bird, Carlos Molina, also known as Chico, and Raul Garcia, also known as Weddle Smooth. All of the men were members of the Mexican Mafia, and 2 of them, Carlos and Raul, were controlling Pacoima. Alberto wasn't a member of the Mexican Mafia, but he was a close associate. Brenda continued doing favors for Alberto, and in return, she was given a comfortable life. For nearly 2 years, they only communicated through phone calls and letters, but Brenda wanted to see him in person. So she boarded a Greyhound bus and took the nearly 400-mile trip from Los Angeles to San Quentin State Prison to visit Alberto. During the visit, Brenda and Alberto were placed inside of an enclosed cage. They spoke for hours and then shared a long hug. On the ride back home, the reality of the situation began setting in, and Brenda started having second thoughts about their relationship. She told Alberto that she didn't want to go through life with the voice on the phone and that she didn't see a future with him. Alberto responded by calling her even more, and when Brenda didn't answer, people would show up at her apartment. In June of 2016, Brenda was leaving a local market when a 31-year-old man named Guillermo Toledo asked her if she needed help with her bags. Guillermo was a member of the Compton Vadio Largo 36 gang and went by the nickname Willie. After a brief conversation, the two exchanged phone numbers. Later that day, Willie stopped by Brenda's apartment to hang out. As they talked, another Largo member showed up and asked to speak to Willie outside. When Willie walked back into the apartment, he asked Brenda was she seeing anyone, and she told him about Alberto. As Brenda and Willie grew closer, she began telling him about the cash, money orders, and phone calls. Willie told her that she was playing a dangerous game and warned her that something really bad could happen if the money ever came up short. At that point, Brenda decided to stop doing favors for Alberto, and when men showed up to the apartment with cash, she refused to take it. As the weeks went on, Brenda and Willie started hanging out more and more, which made Alberto furious. He felt that Willie turned Brenda against him and told her to stop doing favors for him, which in turn disrupted his business. Alberto tried to win Brenda back over and went as far as sending a 7-piece mariachi band to her apartment, along with a bouquet of flowers and balloons that read "Happy Anniversary" to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of their first phone call. Several of Alberto's friends also showed up, and one of them held a phone towards the crowd as Alberto watched the festivities via video call. Willie was at the party, but he and Brenda wouldn't go near each other while Alberto was watching. The party did little to win Brenda over in the long run, and she continued her romance with Willie. Seeing how Brenda wasn't responding to his gestures, Alberto decided to target Willie. He enlisted the help of a Stoners 13 gang member named Michael Haney. Michael was in prison for operating a chop shop when another inmate connected him to Alberto. Once Michael was released from prison, he started doing favors for Alberto. On Monday, October 24th, 2016, Alberto called Michael and said he was having trouble reaching Brenda. He told Michael to go to Brenda's apartment and get him on the phone with Willie, and after the phone call, beat him up. Michael, his brother-in-law Victor, and a member of Pacoima Flats named Francisco then made the trip to Brenda's apartment. Michael and Francisco knocked on the door and told Willie that Alberto wanted to speak with them. Willie said there's nothing to talk about. Michael tried to calm the situation and began making small talk. Brenda also noticed the conversation getting heated and brought out some beers. Victor got out the car to see what was taking so long, and at that time, Willie received a phone call. He walked across the street, and moments later, a black car pulled up. Willie took something from the car and walked back to the apartment with his hand in his pocket. He entered the unit, and Michael said he heard a gun cock. Willie then went back to the porch with his hand in his pocket and agreed to talk to Alberto. The conversation grew heated, and about 5 minutes later, the call ended. Willie told Brenda to go in the house. A few seconds after closing the door, Brenda heard a loud thud against the wall. She ran outside and saw Michael holding Willie while Francisco and Victor punched him. Brenda threw herself in the middle, and Francisco pulled a gun and told her to move or he'll shoot her. Moments later, he opened fire, hitting Willie in the leg. Francisco handed Victor the gun and he aimed it at Willie's head. He then looked over at Francisco. Francisco gave a nod and Victor pulled the trigger. Willie fell to the ground and Brenda ran to his aid. The three men then fled the scene. Willie was transported to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. Michael, Victor, and Francisco were later arrested and charged with Willie's murder. Michael turned state's evidence and admitted that Alberto sent them to Brenda's apartment in order to assault Willie and intimidate Brenda. Prosecutors declined to file charges against Alberto, saying that he's already serving the most severe punishment under the law, and it would be a waste of time and resources filing a new case against him. Alberto continued running his enterprise for years, but even he couldn't escape the politics of the gang world. In 2006, California legislators paused death row executions due to legal challenges over the state's lethal injection protocol, and in 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom placed a moratorium on the death penalty. During these years, death row inmates were transferred to prisons throughout California and were housed with general population inmates. On Thursday, September 26, 2024, at 1:23 p.m., Alberto was on the recreation yard at Calipatria State Prison. Shortly afterwards, he was attacked by another inmate named Tyler Lua using a prison-made weapon. Alberto fell to the ground and Tyler continued hitting him. Two other inmates, Jorge Negrete Larios and Luis Beltran, also began hitting Alberto as he lay motionless on the ground. Correctional officers rushed to the scene and used pepper spray and batons to stop the attack. Prison medical staff attempted to help Alberto, but there was nothing they could do, and at 2:20 p.m., Alberto Martinez was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old. There was no reason given to why the attack occurred, but one thing is for certain, it wasn't random. When attacks like this happen, someone high up the chain of command gave the orders. Armando has taken up art and writing while in prison. Multiple pieces of his work have been published online, including his account of his first day on death row, as well as an art piece that he submitted for an exhibit titled Windows on Death Row. The illustration features a blue prison cell and is meant to show how desolate and hopeless life is as a condemned inmate. David Montemayor's memory lives on through his family and friends. He is remembered as a caring man that would do anything for his family. David's story serves as a cautionary tale on how someone that should love you can be the one that hurts you the most. I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Please like, comment, and subscribe.